Assalamu alaikum, it's Humara from Bond Adams, and we are now starting our legal show again. I'm not too sure if many of you used to listen in the last year, but we used to have a weekly legal show on a Tuesday where we would hold it from either our Bond Adams office on London Road, or we do it from the studio. So what we normally tend to do is we speak about any legal advice that people ask for, or just our legal knowledge in general. Today I'm joined by Oman, who is part of the conveyancing department.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I hope everyone's had a peaceful and restful break over the past 2 weeks.
And what we're going to do today is, so Oman will be speaking to us a bit about residential conveyancing, and then I work in the family law department, so I will then speak a bit about family law and things that people have asked just to be kind of talked about, just so for a bit more knowledge. So Oman, I know you do kind of buying and selling of properties. So why don't you maybe speak to the listeners out there the procedure of maybe buying and selling the house, so kind of essential points and tips and things like that.
That's fine. So whether you're selling a property or whether you're buying a home, it's a good idea to know what is involved and how to understand the conveyancing process. What we'll try to do in this session is we'll try to inform you the steps so it can make it easier or more simpler for you when you're actually going through a transaction yourself. So the process itself is slightly different when you're selling a property, and it's slightly different for when you're buying a property. So let's begin with selling a property. Yep. So the first step is to obviously obtain legal advice. You won't be able to represent yourself in a transaction, and I wouldn't suggest it's a good idea to do so. It's always good to seek that legal representation. So the first step would be to seek a conveyancer or a specialist in that field. So once you've actually found a representation, once you've actually instructed someone, what the solicitors will then do is they'll send out instructions by letter normally or by email, and they'll send out the terms and conditions of their actual firm policies itself and their fixed fee costs. Once you've agreed that, the next step would be the conveyancer would carry out proof of identity and checks. And if you're selling a property, this would be the stage where they would send you the protocol forms. So some people do refer to this as the TA6 or TA10, but this is also known as the property information form and fixtures and fittings. Now, these are the two forms that will contain all the information about the property itself. Some of the information that you'd see in typical documents like this would be things such as what is included in the property itself. So these could be things such as wardrobes, fittings, sockets, lights, bulbs, etc. The second document, the property information form, that would carry more intensive information itself. So in that document, it will show you information such as whether there was any works carried out on the property, whether there was whether there's been any purchases, any services on the boiler itself, any electrical works that's been carried out. So at this stage, the conveyancer would send these documents to the seller. Once this has been complete, the seller would then obtain, or the conveyancer would obtain title deeds from the deeds holder or official copies from land registry itself. Now, if there's an existing mortgage on there, at this stage, they would then send you a letter or a authority form where you would complete this so they can request a redemption statement on your behalf. Now, for the people that don't understand or know what a redemption statement is, if you've got an existing mortgage on a property, a redemption statement would basically give you an amount to clear the remaining balance of the property. Yep. Now, the next step would be the conveyancer would prepare a draft contract and supporting contract documentation, which they would then send to the buyer's conveyancers. Now, the draft contract and the supporting documentation would contain information such as the property information form, the fixtures and fitting, the contract, and any other title-related documents. At this stage, the buyer's conveyancer would then raise any pre-contractual inquiries with the seller's conveyancer, and some of these questions may be referred directly to the conveyancer, and most of them will directly be to the seller itself. Now, the conveyancer can assist you with these questions. However, it would obviously be up to the seller to answer them to the best of his knowledge. Now, once obviously that pre-inquiry stage has been satisfied and the buyers are happy with the inquiries that have been, or the answers that have been provided to them, the next step would be to obviously agree dates for exchange and completion. Now, what you need to understand is, once you actually go forward to exchange, you actually enter into a legally binding contract. Now, both parties would be legally bounded to the contract, which means that they would have to carry out the obligations of the transaction itself. Now, once the completion date has been agreed, they would formally exchange, meaning both parties are legally committed to the transaction. The seller's conveyancer will obtain a settlement figure to repay the outstanding amount for any existing mortgages, and if applicable, the buyer's conveyancer will draft a transfer deed and send that to the seller's conveyancer. Now, the seller will need to approve this prior to obviously moving forward to exchange or completion. The seller's conveyancer will also need to check the transfer deed and send to the seller for signature in readiness for completion. And at this stage, they would not require any dates on any of the documents. This would be done on completion day. Now, the seller must also vacate the property at a time to be agreed and make arrangements to hand over the keys. Now, this is usually done through the estate agents. If there isn't any estate agents involved and this is a private sale, this would be done directly between the seller and the buyer. Now, the seller's conveyancer will need to send the title deeds and the transfer deeds to the buyer's conveyancer once they have completed on the transaction. So once all the funds are in, once they've exchanged, the buyers on completion day will send the funds over to the seller. And once the seller has confirmed the funds are in, that's when completion would take place. Now, at that moment where completion has taken place, the seller's conveyancer will send all the title deeds and the documents over to the buyers, as they would need this for land registry when they are registering the property or applying for the buyer in their name. Yeah. Now, the process is slightly different when you're buying a property. Now, I'll try and simplify this as quick as possible for you. Now, the first step is the buyer makes an offer on the property, which is then accepted by the seller. The second step would be the buyer's conveyancer is instructed on the acceptance of the offer. So this works very similar to a sale. The buyer would arrange a survey on the property and make an application for a mortgage if required. If you're a cash buyer, you don't necessarily need to make any searches, or you don't necessarily. There are a few steps that you can skip out, but again, this is at your discretion completely. We would advise you to obviously seek representation and obviously undertake the necessary checks when you're buying a property. If you're buying with a mortgage, it is very important that you actually contact the lender and you ask their specific requirements. It may be a requirement that you have to undertake searches on the property, such as underdoing an environmental search or a water and drainage search. Now, the buyer's conveyancer will confirm instructions by letter, setting out the terms of business and fee costs. So this works, again, the same as a sale transaction. Once this has been confirmed, the buyer's conveyancer will contact the seller's conveyancer to obtain the contract pack. Obviously, at this point, the buyers will then check the contract pack to see if there's any issues, if any documents are missing, and at this point, they will raise any inquiries and they will carry out any necessary checks. I think at the moment, to undertake checks, it is anywhere between 2 and 4 weeks, but again, that is entirely dependent on the local authority and which area you're buying the property in. The result of the searches and the mortgage offer, the buyer then considers this report and raises questions on anything that is unclear. Once all inquiries have been satisfied, when the buyer is happy to proceed, arrangements are made for the deposit to be paid to the buyer's conveyancer in readiness for exchange of contracts. So like I mentioned earlier, once you exchange contracts, normally a 10% deposit is required. So let's just say you're buying a property for around £300,000. 10% of £300,000 would be 30k. So on exchange day, whichever date you agree, you would normally be required to pay the 30k on exchange. However, there are obviously if your completion date is very close to the exchange date, you can some solicitors don't actually require a deposit to be paid, so you can pay the remaining balance on completion day. The money would just be held to order. Once all of this has been approved, the buyer's conveyancer starts to make preparations in readiness for completion. And once they've passed the exchange stage, the seller solicitor will need to approve the draft transfer deed, and a final copy is made. This will need to be signed by the buyers before being sent to the sellers for signature by the buyer in readiness for completion. The buyer's conveyancer prepares a completion statement, carries out any completion searches and applies to the buyer's mortgage lender for the mortgage loan. Now, on completion, the seller will need to vacate the property by the agreed time, and the buyer's conveyancer sends the proceeds of sales to the seller's conveyancer. Now, the seller's conveyancer releases the keys to the estate agent if one is used, and sends the title deeds and transfer deeds to the buyer's conveyancer together with an undertaking to repay any existing mortgage if there is a mortgage. The buyer's conveyancer will then send stamp duty payable to HMRC. That's of course if there is any stamp duty payable. They would then receive the title deed transfer and proof that the seller has paid the outstanding mortgage on the property. Once the land registry is happy with this, at this point the property would then be registered on the new applicant's name.
So, I mean, I've heard a lot about auction properties as well.
Yeah.
That's quite popular.
It is really popular.
Can you tell us a bit about auction properties?
Yep, so in terms of auction properties, let's have a look. So what you would have to do is to ensure that you're ready for an auction property, there are very essential steps that you will need to take. So I'd say the first thing is to actually get a hold of the viewing catalogue. So this is normally available in print and online around 3 weeks. You can request for the auctioneers to provide this to you directly by post. Each property will be listed with a guide price. This is different from the reserve price, which is normally kept confidential. The reserve price basically means that this is the minimum price that the seller will usually accept. You need to be aware that the guide price and reserve prices can change up to and on the day of auction. So that's very, very essential. So you need to make sure when you go to the auction house, you need to make sure that nothing has been changed. You just confirm that with the auctioneers. It's very important to register with the auction house. A lot of people just tend to turn up to auction houses without actually registering, and then they find out, obviously, they're not able to bid. It's very important to view the property before you're actually entering any auctions. You can do this by booking viewings through the auctioneer or agent. I would advise to take a specialist with you, such as a builder or a surveyor, just to get the advice on any costs of repairs to help you decide how much to bid. One of the key things, I think this is very, very important, is to arrange a mortgage in principle. If you're a cash buyer, that's perfect. You don't need any type of funding. You've got the cash readily available. But if you're not a cash buyer and you are hoping to obviously fund the transaction with any sort of funding, it's very, very important to arrange a mortgage in principle. Now, you can do this by obviously obtaining advice from a mortgage advisor, and they can help you with this. If your bid is successful, you'll have to set a number of days in which to exchange and complete, so you need to have the right mortgage. It's very, very important that you get the legal pack checked as well prior to bidding on the auction. A lot of properties have a lot of restrictions on there that may take a few weeks to obviously remove. This is something that a lot of people need to bear in mind as well. It would be important as well to get an independent valuation. So this is to check that you won't be paying over the odds. Something else that a lot of people need to think about as well is to decide and set your price limit. So a lot of people go there and they have a fear of missing out. So they have no guide price. They have no set price of what they will bid, and obviously that is not good. So, and another thing that you need to bear in mind as well is you need to arrange buildings insurance. So once you've actually bid on a property and it becomes legally binding, so it's different to the traditional private sale when you're buying a property. So at auction, one of the biggest risks is when you buy a property, you automatically exchange contracts, which means, like I said earlier, you automatically become bounded to the contract. Now, if you try to back out the transaction at any point, you could either lose your 10% deposit, you could be taken to court for specific performance. So that's something. So what that basically means is, if you're taken to court for specific performance and you're held liable, what would happen is the courts will order you to complete the transaction. Now, like I said, if you don't have a mortgage in principle or you don't have any funds ready, there's no way that you can fund that transaction, so you will automatically lose your deposit. If the property price, like I said earlier, if it's around 300k and you put a 10% deposit of 30k, you would automatically lose that 30k. Now, I'll explain a little bit about how the auction process works so the listeners will understand. So now on the day of the auction, you need to ensure that you take the right paperwork. So this includes things like your photo ID, proof of residency, details of your solicitor, and the means of paying the deposit. So we would advise that you have the funds readily available before you enter a auction house or auctioneers. Listen for any last minute changes before the bidding actually begins. The auctioneer will check that everybody has a copy of the addendum or the information sheet, and will read out any alterations to the catalogue details. This is the point where if you are unsure of anything, you can raise any questions and you can get that answered. Now, make sure your bids are very clear as well, and don't get caught up in the moment. Always stick to the budget, never bid more than what you can afford. If you can't be at the auction house in person, you can bid remotely. There are a lot of options. You can bid by proxy, so the auctioneers will place bids on your behalf up to your specified limit. You can bid over the phone by telephone. The auctioneers will call you, so you can bid live over the phone and they'll do that on your behalf, or you can bid online, and this can be done from a PC or a tablet. If your bid is successful, you'll usually have to pay 10% of the sale price on the day as deposit. The remaining 90%, usually with most auction houses, you have around 28 days to complete. If you don't pay this, like I said earlier, you'll lose the deposit and you'll lose the property as well. So a lot of people need to consider as well that there are a lot of fees and administration costs to the auction house, which is usually between £200 to £1,000. It could be more, it could be less. You just will have to get that confirmed prior to bidding. You need to also consider stamp duty, land tax. If you're not a first-time buyer, there will obviously be SDLT payable if the property value is over a certain amount. You need to consider your conveyancing, solicitor fees. Some auction houses have special conditions such as that you will have to pay for the seller's legal fees as well. So it's very, very important to read the special conditions. There's a lot of survey costs that you need to bear in mind. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, there's buildings insurance as well. Now, there are two types of auction methods in the UK. One is the traditional type, and that's the one where you'll exchange and you'll have to complete within 28 days. Now, the more modern version is a modern auction. Now, this one, you have 56 days to complete. This is less risk-free because you're not actually exchanging straight away. So you have 56 days from when the draft contract pack is issued to exchange and complete. Now, with this transaction, with a modern auction, it's slightly different because they don't have the 10% deposit. They have something called a reservation fee. Now, if you back out the transaction, you lose the reservation fee. You just need to confirm with the auction house what the reservation fee is. Yep. Usually it's a certain percent of the property value. Some properties, like I mentioned, some property auctions are held online. There are a lot of advantages with buying at auctions as well. Like, for example, if you're buying through auction, speed, the efficiency of the transaction itself would be a great advantage. If you're looking to buy a property and you want to get it done and dusted with, like I mentioned, 28 days, that is a very fast time. As opposed to if you go through the traditional route, if you're buying a property through a private sale, it could take anywhere between 3 months to 9 months, especially if you got any lending involved. You can move quickly with the entire home buying process completed within a set of weeks, as often as 28 days. Transparency, that's another advantage as well. You'll be able to see other bids for yourself, and there is no risk at all. Fairness, there is no pressure to get your offer in first, as with other property buying methods. Another advantage is once the auction or once you've bought the property, the deal's done, so the process is not affected by lengthy delays from other parties or breakdowns in communication, and there is a lot of choice as well, so you're not restricted in that aspect. There is a lot of reliability as well, so contracts are signed as soon as the auction is over. Now, like I mentioned as well, although there's a lot of advantages, there are some disadvantages as well. Everything has to be done really quickly. Now, if you haven't got a mortgage in place, that falls under a great disadvantage. Now, from arranging a survey to asking your solicitor to check the legal pack, other things you need to watch out for is, do you have your funding in place? If your bid is successful, you need to be able to pay the 10% deposit there and then, and the remainder shortly after. Something else you will need to consider is, will you go over budget? A lot of people, what they do is they go with a set amount, and because they have the fear of missing out, they'll start to tend to go over that budget. So make sure you set yourself a limit, as it's easy to get carried away on the day. Will the price change? Now, the guide price is often set low to generate interest and is not an estimate of the likely sale price. Rising guide price can mean there's a lot of interest from competing buyers and the property you're you've got your eye on could sell for a great deal more than you expected. And buyers beware. So this basically means that defective properties with structural problems, short leases, defective covenants, such as no legal right of access or restrictive covenants, such as how the property can be modified or extended, are often sold through auction. So, like I mentioned earlier, it is really important to get that legal representation prior to entering an auction.
Okay, well, that's quite helpful actually. And what kind of things should you look for? So when buying a house, what's important to look at, or maybe to look out for, just to kind of avoid getting yourself in a bit of a mess, I guess.
Definitely. So what I would say is if you're in the process of buying a property and you're in the stage of viewing properties,
Yeah.
one of the biggest signs is to keep an eye out for the signs of damp. Now, the main giveaway signs for damp is mouldy smell. You can tell by the flaking plastering boards or watermarked walls or ceilings. Now, this is very important. This is what I mentioned earlier. It's very, very important for you to take someone specialized in that area, such as a builder or a
Yeah.
structural surveyor with you. You can obviously, it may cost you a little bit extra, but obviously it's a risk-free process, if that makes sense. You could save yourself a lot of money by finding these issues earlier on in the transaction. I would say if you're visiting a property, it would be very, very important to make sure that the structure itself is sound.
Yeah.
Now, you can tell if a property is going through issues by looking at a wall and seeing big cracks. You could see hairline cracks. If you're looking around, if the property's had any alterations or any extensions, you can just have a look at where the joints are and the bay windows and just have a look. So you can call a surveyor and then they can investigate that for you later.
Okay.
So it's very, very important to also know whether the property has any access ways. So whether there's any flying freehold. Flying freehold basically means whether any part of the property is overhanging with the neighboring property. Now, if you're buying with a mortgage, that could be a big problem with your lender.
Yeah.
Now, it's very, very important to go visit the property itself. A lot of people think that they can see the photos online and that's it. But you need to understand that some of these people that are selling the properties, they take photos in certain ways. They make the property look more appealing. So it's always best to go and visit the property itself. You need to also ensure that is the room or is the house big enough for your own needs. That's a major thing as well. A lot of people they look at photos online and they think this room's really big, and when they get there or when they bid an auction and they tie to the contract, the space that they've seen is nothing like what the pictures they've seen online. So cleverly placed mirrors, strategic lighting, delicious smells, cozy fires, and fresh licks of paint are all trick sellers use to make homes more appealing. It's nice to feel you can move straight in without having to do anything, but try to remain objective. And if the furnishing makes the space, take photos and ask what they are leaving behind. So you need to also ensure that there's certain things such as the roof itself, the structure itself is in place.
Yeah.
Replacing a roof is really, really expensive, especially with the recent pricing, the recent surge of prices as well.
Yeah, no, definitely.
If the property has a flat or nearly a flat roof, it's really important to check out the material which has been used to seal it. Nowadays, a membrane is used and is better than asphalt on gravel, which can leave seems unsealed.
Okay, so that's quite interesting. So if anyone has any questions, you can always, we're on social media, so you can always kind of drop us a message, and we'll be more than happy to either respond via direct messages, or you can even give us a call, or we can obviously just pick it up on our next session. So let me just have a look. So do you have any top tips for buying a property?
Like I mentioned earlier, buying a property is one of the biggest purchases you will make in your lifetime. Therefore, getting it right the first time is very, very crucial. Some of the things that you need to consider, some of the main things that I tell all my clients or anyone that asks me for advice, is to always have your mortgage and finance in place. A lot of people don't actually get the mortgage or finance because of their credit scores. So it's really, really important to check your credit score. You can use websites. You can contact your bank. They sometimes can give you a credit score rating. You can use online such as Experian. Before applying for a mortgage, a simple credit mistake can cause rejection to your mortgage application. And let's face it, no one really likes rejection. So there are a number of things that you can do to help boost your credit score, and you can do this by securing yourself a mortgage. So make sure all active accounts are registered to your current and right address. So that is something that can affect your mortgage. Like I said, it is really good to have a mortgage broker in place. They will be able to advise you further. But these are some of the little things that will obviously make a difference to your application. Something else that you need to consider as well, if you're a first-time buyer, it could be a daunting process. So especially when it's your, especially if you're got lending involved as well. So you need to know how to budget, and you need to stick to what you can afford. Something really important as well is very, very important to research the area. So it's worth asking the questions that are going through your mind with the seller directly itself. Is there a club nearby? Is there shops nearby? Is it busy at night time? These are the really questions that will affect the value of the property. If is the road very busy? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, definitely.
I hope this information helps.
Okay, so that's quite informative. So yeah, like I said, if you have any questions, then feel free to either drop us a message across our social media, and we'll definitely get back to you. Yeah.
That's fine. Humar, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? So I know that you work in the family department, yeah?
Yeah, that's
so
right.
Why don't you tell us about divorce law? I know that the law has changed recently, and it wasn't not so long ago, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. So I think it was maybe towards the middle, early 2022, where the divorce kind of procedure changed. Prior to that, it was a bit more different. But now they've kind of made it so now when you have a divorce application, you can apply by yourself, or you can even do it with your partner. So that was something that they never had the option for before. So now what you're able to do is you and your partner are both able to kind of jointly apply for the application, and you also don't have to put a reason as to why you want to get a divorce. I know before there was like 5 reasons as to why you want to get a divorce. So it could be like behavior, it could be just that you've been separated for so many years. There's quite a few options, but now there's actually no reason to even give a reason. You just kind of have to fill out the application and submit it to the courts, really. So yeah, you can either do it jointly or you can do it by yourself. It doesn't really make a difference to the price. It doesn't really make a difference to the process, unless of course the other side don't want the divorce. Then obviously it becomes a bit harder, and it may just kind of lengthen it out a bit. But in terms of cost, it's still the £593 court fee. And you are able to kind of get help with fees online as well if you are on kind of low income. But I mean, it's the divorce process itself has changed as well. So now, if you was to kind of apply, you fill out the application as normal and you send it to the courts.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, if you apply solely, then it gets sent to the other side, and they have to kind of acknowledge the divorce. So they have to say whether they accept it or they refuse it. In terms of refusal, you have to have a proper reason as to why you don't want to get a divorce. It can't just be obviously because you don't want one. And I know before we could kind of dispute the divorce if someone gave a reason that wasn't true, but now that there's no reason, there's no option to give a reason as to why the marriage broke down irretrievably. Now it's more just kind of, you have to have a reason as to why you think you shouldn't get a divorce. So whether you think legally it shouldn't happen, or for some other reason, but it can't just be because you don't want a divorce from that person. Now, once you apply for that divorce, it gets sent to the other side and they have to acknowledge it. So they kind of have to send a letter to say, yep, they've seen the divorce and they're happy with it. Once the courts have kind of been satisfied that, the other side is aware of the divorce, that's when they'll carry on to the next stage. I mean, there's obviously some instances where, partners move out and they don't keep in contact for years, or it could be sometimes your partner's in prison, so there's not really a way to kind of send them a letter. In them instances, the courts have created a kind of application procedure where you can kind of send it or make sure that they have sight of it. So for example, for someone like you don't know where they live anymore, you can ask the courts to send it by email. So the court documents are sent to that person by email, and then the courts will be satisfied that you've done enough to to kind of serve the documents on the other side.
Okay.
Once that's done, that's when they kind of go to the next stage. So once they are happy that the respondent, which is either your ex-partner, has been served the documents, then you will need to kind of wait at least 20 weeks before you move to the next stage. They kind of give this 20-week period because in that time, sometimes people don't try reconciling or mediation until after they submitted the divorce application, because in some instances, parties don't take it seriously until something has been submitted, and then they kind of, think, okay, no, I want to try. So they give you that 20-week period to kind of reconcile or, try and talk things out where you can stop the divorce from going ahead or kind of finalizing. Once that happens, once you submit the 20 weeks, and then the courts will send you a pronouncement date. So a pronouncement date is a date where there will be a conditional order. So a conditional order is your midway divorce, formerly known as a decree nisi. So this is the middle ground of your divorce. So they'll kind of set a hearing where you don't really need to attend. No one needs to attend. It's just for the courts to kind of set that, it's halfway through the divorce, and then you can move to the next stage. At this stage, you can kind of deal with any finances and things like that. So finances are quite important as well. So it's kind of just submitting a consent order. Either, if it's agreed, then you can have a clean break where you both walk away with your own things. You can have a settlement where you both agree that, one person should pay this much and the other person gets to keep something in return, or something agreed. The reason why it's important to have one is because that kind of fully gets you out of the marriage in terms of finances. Because if you don't have a financial order in place, that person can still, in 10 years' time, that person can still pursue you for finances. So, for example, if you was to have a divorce this year, and you didn't do a financial order, in 10 years' time, whatever you have at 10 years' time, they can still pursue anything you have in your name. So it's kind of better to kind of get it all done at the same time, so that when there'll be no surprise in so many years' time, maybe if you kind of have so much money in so many years' time. So you can kind of just have like a consent order just to kind of end things on the finance side. After you receive the conditional order, you have to wait 6 weeks and 1 day. So similar to the previous process where you have to wait 6 weeks 1 day from the decree nisi stage, where you can apply for the final order. Until you don't receive the final order, you're not divorced. So you have to wait until you get that final order certificate to kind of put down that you are divorced and you're not married no longer. I think this process is kind of much better in terms of there's kind of like there's no blame game, no hostility, no kind of, because I think when you have to put the blame on someone, then it just gets a bit hostile and there's a bit of tension there. Whereas this is just straightforward, no need for each party to kind of have their corner or have their say. It's just you send it to the court, you have to get the divorce done, and that's it. And it kind of makes it easier for everyone involved. So obviously, some families, there's children involved, so it kind of makes it easier for the whole family to get through it as well.
Would you say that this process itself is it a lengthy process?
In terms of length, I mean, it just depends.
Yeah.
Predominantly, it just depends on whether your partner responds to the divorce petition or not. That's the main thing. If they don't, then it would get stretched out a bit.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
You'd have to kind of get like a process serve or a bailiff to serve the documents on them, and it's whether the courts are satisfied that's enough. And there's always obviously court delays. So we can never actually tell you how long it will take, only because we don't know what the courts are working on, the time frames.
That's fine. And do you have any advice to the listeners that are going through a divorce?
I'd always advise to obviously always try and reconcile to see if you can obviously refrain from getting divorced. Mediation services are always available across many firms. They do have mediation services. There's just companies and organisations itself. But yeah, I mean, in terms of getting a divorce, we at Bond Adams, our family law team, make it quite easy for you to kind of go through the whole process. We liaise with the other ex-partner just to make it all swift and smoothly. And I just feel like this process is much easier and it's probably much quicker as well. Because since the time it started, I believe it was April 2022.
Yeah.
I think we had someone in that first week, and I think just before Christmas, they broke up, and that divorce was completed and final. So yeah, I would say it's much quicker.
That's fine. Thank you for that information.
No problem. So I hope everyone enjoyed the show today. If anyone does have any questions, or if you would require any advice on any of your matters, we do immigration, wills and probate, family law, conveyancing, litigation. Feel free to you can give us a call on 0116 285 8080, and someone will just take some details down and we'll give you a call back. Or you can pop into our office on London Road or Uppingham Road. But thank you for listening. We've got a Birmingham officer as well on Soho Road. But yeah, thank you for listening, and you will hear from us next week by 2 other colleagues.